meant to illustrate the gap between men's and women's wages. The date each year symbolizes how far into the year the average woman must work in order to catch up to what men made the previous year. The fact that this date is still observed nearly 30 years later means that there are things we can all do today to help balance those scales. My guest today is Annette Tyman, partner at Seyfarth Shaw. Annette is the co-chair of Seyfarth's People Analytics Group, advising employers on pay equity, diversity, inclusion, and OFCCP compliance issues. Annette, thanks so much for joining me here today on Project HR.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, just as a note before we begin, my goal with this episode is not to wring our hands about the current state of pay equity, but to try and sort out where we are in this moment and identify the things that we can do to help set the stage for more improvement in this effort. So, I want to start off first by talking about Equity Pay Day. How valid a measure is it? What does it tell us about where we are at the time of this recording?
Well, it's very interesting because it is a date that has been selected to identify how far into the year women have to work, as you mentioned, to catch up with the average pay of men in that particular year. If you're looking online at sources, there's various data points this year in particular. So it's interesting to see where we're ultimately going to land. The idea is that what this number really tells us is what that wage gap looks like without taking into account the factors that we know are important to pay. So, really, what it's measuring is differences in careers
Mm-hmm.
that women may
Mm-hmm.
select versus men. So I look at it as more of a societal issue as opposed to the sub issue that I tend to be more focused on is what specifically employers
Mm-hmm.
dealing with their specific employee population can do on the issue of pay.
So, before we get too deep into the discussion, I want to outline the difference between pay equity and pay equality, because that differentiation is important.
Yes, absolutely. So there's lots of definitions also that are out there on this. I think about pay equity as a fairness comparison, although oftentimes the terms are used interchangeably. When we're talking about pay equality, those are typically grounded in some legal theory. So the concept is equal pay for equal work
Mm-hmm.
or equal pay for substantially similar or comparable work. So they're two, slightly different concepts, although very related. And it's certainly we hear a lot of overlap when folks are talking about pay equity issues.
And pay equity and pay equality are the right things to do, of course. But this is more than just doing the right thing. This is good for business as well. Can you share with me some of the benefits?
Absolutely. So, yeah, some of the benefits, I mean, if you're in the employment context these days, I mean, employees certainly are asking a lot. So, in this age right now, you may have been talking about the great resignation. So, there's a
Mhm,
big war
mhm,
for talent
mhm,
these days, and issues of pay equity are top of mind. So, employees, candidates are often very interested in what employers are doing around equal pay issues, how transparent they're being. They're asking lots of questions. So, beyond the issue of paying employees fairly and consistently with the work that they are doing, regardless of issues like race or gender, there is this, just corporate culture. Issue that we are seeing that has been cropping up more significantly in the past several years.
mhm. And of course, people analytics can help us use data to find solutions to difficult workplace issues. How can data help us gain traction on an issue like pay equity?
Well, the data is so critically important. So when we're talking about a specific employer and we're looking at their data, they may have some ideas about how compensation or how they intend compensation to actually be impacting their workforce. So they might say something like, we pay for performance.
Mhm,
Or we value experience, and there are certain types of experience that they're valuing. The data that they both capture in an electronic or digitized way that allows us to do a statistical regression or some sort of analysis to evaluate that pay oftentimes leads to eye opening. Issues that prop up, issues that sometimes they didn't even realize. There might be a local office that is handling pay a little bit differently
mm,
than others, and so the data helps actually tell the story of what's happening, and also it tells you where there's data gaps.
mm,
Because oftentimes it's not really a pay gap that we're seeing, but a data gap that we're seeing.
hmm,
And to try and go back and really track down what happened, for example, when somebody was hired 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that really set that starting pay to understand where they are today is
Hmm.
can be a real challenge and an area that really the data needs to, I think, evolve a bit more for employers.
Interesting. All right, Annette, I have to take a quick sponsorship break right now, but when we come back, I want to discuss the findings of Seyfarth's latest Equal Pay Day update. Back in a moment.
The relationships you have with your employees are critical to the success of your business. In today's ever-evolving political and economic climate, those relationships can also be the most vulnerable. Employee dissatisfaction can lead to union organizing activity, potentially disrupting operations, leading to costly lawsuits and negative publicity for your company. The I Labor Relations Consulting team brings with it a wide range of expertise, from former labor management executives to human resources professionals, and even award-winning communication experts. We'll help you create an environment where employees feel valued. Our goal is simple. We help your company thrive while creating a positive working environment. Get started today with a personalized labor relations readiness assessment from IRI. We'll provide you with a customized roadmap and the resources you need to succeed. Visit us at iconsultants.com to learn more.
I'm back here on Project HR with Annette Tyman, co-chair of the People Analytics Group at Seyfarth Shaw. Annette, in the People Analytics Group at Seyfarth, you publish an annual Equity Pay Day legal update. Since Equal Pay Day is coming up soon, can we expect that update soon?
Yes, absolutely. We are putting our final touches on that report, and we'll be coming out with a webinar. Some of the trends that we are seeing include amendments to equal pay laws at a state level. We are seeing an increase on salary history bans and retaliation claims that are being brought there. We're also seeing pay scale disclosure requirements and calls for greater transparency, and that is coming in multiple fronts, both from laws, but also from employees and stakeholders, shareholders that are requesting greater transparency. And then finally, we are seeing paid data reporting. We are seeing new laws crop up, and that is a trend that we do expect to see going forward. So, required reporting of compensation data to various agencies.
And you reported an acceleration in employer focus on equal pay in 2020. Did that continue in 2021?
Absolutely. We are continuing to see employers supremely focused on their compensation, whether they're doing equal pay audits or they are proactively trying to understand whether they should go ahead and start publishing some sort of pay metric that informs information about their compensation and sets sort of a benchmark for their own their employee base, just to understand where what they're doing on an equal pay perspective.
And 2020 also showed an increased percentage in the passage of pay equity laws. Did that also continue in 2021?
That continues, and we're tracking them consistently for new laws that are cropping up. Illinois, for example, passed a law that will require employers to proactively provide employee level compensation data
Mm.
to the Illinois Department of Labor. So that's a key area. We're also seeing more states coming out, or cities, I should say, New York City, for example, that is requiring employers to provide more transparency in the salary ranges that are offered to employees for specific jobs. So we do expect that to continue.
Interesting. And hand in hand with that, of course, 2020 showed increased litigation under federal and state laws around this topic. How did we fare on that front in the last year?
Yeah, lots of equal pay claims. Some of those cases are taking quite some time to make it through. Some of them are coming in, especially in California, in a sort of not nationwide, I should say statewide class action claims. And there are several big name cases that we are following and tracking. And there have been some decisions in 2021. Those battles are still being fought, and I believe will continue in the very near future.
Yeah, certainly of concern for employers. Annette, I'm going to take some time out for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and my guest today is Annette Tyman, co-chair of the People Analytics Group at Seyfarth Shaw. We are back. So, Annette, let's talk about the things that HR professionals can do to narrow the wage gap, or at least contribute to an environment of supporting pay equity. Pay transparency has certainly gotten a lot of buzz in recent years. Are we finally ready to embrace this concept?
That's interesting. I talk to employers almost daily about the issue of pay transparency. Whether an employer decides to put their information out or not, I do think what it is driving is a conversation about how their compensation looks. There is a increased desire to look at compensation in different ways, to analyze how they are paying, to look at their compensation structures, and really get behind the data and what the data is saying from an analysis perspective.
Mm.
So I think that regardless of whether employers decide to publish information about, sort of be more transparent to the external world, the conversation is driving changes in behaviors,
Mm.
driving changes in looking deeper and really trying to understand where they are from a pay perspective and from a data perspective. So, collecting better data from their workforce to help them make better decisions going forward.
And pay audits are typically the first step in addressing pay equity issues in a workplace. So, what does a typical pay audit involve?
Yeah, so that's so interesting. I spend a lot of my time working on pay reviews for employers. The first step is really to outline what the scope of that review is going to be. So whether we're looking at a specific location, a state, U.S. Company wide, or even global pay equity audits. So we're first looking at the scope. We are looking and describing what are the components that we are going to be looking at or evaluating. So whether it's base pay, bonus, equity, all of those various components have different ways of, employers have different ways of compensating on each of those fronts. So together, we're looking with a typically a core internal team at the employer, as well as a team of attorneys and also really experienced labor economists professionals that run the analytics.
Mm.
And what we are doing is really trying to mirror what the employer says how they pay, right? So if an employer says, for example, I used the example earlier about for performance,
Hmm.
we're going to want to get several years of performance data and pull that in, for example, to a regression analysis to help us evaluate compensation. That's not the only component. There's lots of components like tenure, the jobs that employees are in, but we're really trying to understand their compensation structure and
Hmm.
running an analysis. And
Hmm.
then typically, after we run that analysis, there's conversations. If we are seeing areas that require additional review, we're looking at it from multiple standpoints. One
Hmm.
could be that employees are actually underpaid, right? So it could be women are in fact underpaid as compared to men.
Hmm.
Sometimes we find that there are men that are underpaid according to our analysis. So there's discussions around how to go about doing that. But oftentimes, what we find is that the policies or practices overall need to be revised. So sometimes, for example, there are differences in geography that a company has never formalized in their compensation structure. So once we identify that as an issue, then they have a longer process around, understanding, well, what should the pay range be for jobs in New York City, for example, as compared to jobs in Missouri? And if they
Hmm.
haven't formalized it, then the analysis doesn't really say, okay, folks should get increase in pay, but I look at remediation broader, and that being how do we go about making practice adjustments to your compensation structure so that there's a better understanding of how actually those pay decisions are being made across the organization.
And it's fascinating, but I could see where it might also be overwhelming. So, is this something that the people analytics team at Seyfarth can help organizations with? And what other services do you offer to companies looking to improve pay equity?
Oh, absolutely. We spend a significant amount of time working on pay equity matters, helping employers, analyze everything from the proactive side, setting up their compensation policies and practices, to doing the audits, to defending in litigation matters. And we do all of that work in house. So we have in house labor economist professionals that we partner with to do this work.
Hmm.
In addition, some of the other services that you asked about, we do a lot of work in the diversity and inclusion space.
Mm.
So we're also analyzing workforce issues generally, and those sometimes have pay components. So, policies and practices that employers might have to improve their diversity of women or minorities in their workforce can have an implication for pay equity issues. So, we're mindful of all of those, and our team is well positioned to assist in all of those areas.
And we talked about the latest Equal Pay Day update, but that's not the only pay equity resource available from Seyfarth. Tell me about the reference guides that your team has produced.
Yes, absolutely. We have a global survey that we put out for employers to help them navigate their global requirements. We also have a litigation report that outlines some of the key litigation matters that have happened in over the last year, and then we have a pay equity desktop reference that is essentially a 50-state survey that answers questions around what laws there are within a particular state. So we cover all 50 states in that resource. So it's very helpful for employers.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we wanted to find out more about you or about Seyfarth's People Analytics Group, where could we go?
Well, I am on LinkedIn. Seyfarth Shaw is our firm name. You can look me up there. We have a page dedicated to the People Analytics Group, and then Pay Equity is essentially a subgroup of the overall People Analytics Group. So you can look me up there. My phone number, my work number is 312-460-5943. And my email address is atyman@seyfarth.com. That's atyman@seyfarth.com.
Excellent. Just as a reminder to our listeners, we do all the hard work for you. We've listened back to this episode, taken detailed notes, and you can download that episode companion at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Right now, though, Annette, it is time for our lightning round questions, and these are questions I like to ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
All right. The first question is always a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about pay equity and narrowing the pay gap. Annette, with that in mind, which gap is better? Clothing retailer and shopping mall fixture The Gap, or 1970s R&B group The Gap Band?
Well, you might tell from my age, the Gap Band.
All right. I'll go with that. Not a problem. All right. Next question. What is the best book you've read recently?
Recently, I am diving into The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Comer.
Oh, that sounds like a good one.
Yeah.
All right. What is your favorite thing about the work that you do?
I get to help employers just be better, and they have a deep desire to take care of their employee workforce, and sometimes they just need help understanding the data and, taking a complicated analysis and simplifying it for them.
For sure. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Put it in a box. Be present in the moment in what you're doing. Everything else goes in a box.
Oh, that's a good mental construct. I really like that.
Yes.
All right, last question. Who or what inspires you?
I would say comeback stories of any kind. So I'm pretty involved in, some organizations that, really help, try to help underserved communities, and to see people grow and thrive and to watch people just overcome obstacles is the highlight of my life.
For sure. Thanks so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR, Annette.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks too to our listeners. Once again, this is your reminder to grab the companion guide for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. If you'd like to be on Project HR, or you know someone who would, feel free to email us, projecthr@projectionsinc.com. And last but certainly not least, make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR. I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or give us a handful of stars wherever you get your content. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.